Hello everyone. Hopefully you have had a chance now to look at the cognitive skills flipped lectures, both the basic cognitive skills and higher order cognitive skills. This flipped lecture is going to show you how to take that information about specific skill deficits and utilize it to come up with specific treatment strategies. Okay, so today's objectives are going to be the following. Can you compare and contrast approaches to remediating cognitive skill deficits? Give an example of how you might use those frames of reference to address a problem with, for example, sequencing a daily activity. Sequencing is just one example of a cognitive skill. Feel free to use other examples as well as you're trying to understand these different models. So the three that we're going to look at today are the neurofunctional approach, the cognitive disability model by Allen, and the dynamic interactional approach by Joan Toglia. Which of the examples that you provided above of these different strategies are bottom-up and which are top-down? We'll be going over that in a little bit. And which of the examples that you provided are remediation strategies and which are compensation strategies? So remember, remediation is building a skill, and then compensation has to do with not changing the individual's ability, but looking at modifications to the task or environmental adaptations that support the person's current ability and skill. Okay, so when we think about remediation of cognitive skills, we have to think about whether or not we're going to remediate with a specific approach like mass repetition, if we're going to use specific strategies to cue someone. Whichever strategy we decide, our foundational guiding principle is that if we improve this cognitive skill, the client will be able to engage in an occupation. So it's a very bottom-up way to think about how to address cognitive deficits. For example, if my client's ability to sequence improves, he will be able to complete his morning routine independently to get ready for work. Okay, so skill to occupation. This might involve repeated practice, both in and out of a specific context. It might involve homework, specific strategies for remembering information, or tying one set of activities to the next in order to complete that routine. It often involves some self-awareness, and the way that we get to self-awareness is to redevelop someone's private speech, that kind of internal narrative you use to walk yourself through your activities. And so a lot of times we're providing verbal feedback as someone moves through their activities to do that. And then treatment should also involve some component of compensation. Have we thought about supports that would promote someone's ability to remediate sequencing, for example? And we'll talk about some of those. So this is Allen's cognitive disability frame of reference. And she talks about, this was developed in the 60s, and mostly just through observation of people who had experienced injuries to their cognitive capacity, so brain injuries, different things like that. And what she looked at were patterns of behavior. And so these levels represent what she came up with through her observations. They're patterns of cognitive levels. And so what she did was she went back and defined what each cognitive level might look like, and that's what those examples represent. Allen's cognitive level screen is a tool that we looked at in class the other day. It's the leather lacing tool, and that is a screening tool that's very effective in identifying the level of cognitive ability that a client might have just by watching how they perform on that test. So this kind of gives you some examples of what that looks like. Allen's levels can also be broken out into what she calls modes of performance. So within each of these levels, modes can be further delineated that further describe how close someone is to either the level below or the level above, and you can find more information in your text on that. I like this slide too. This is actually a slide that was put together by a rehab company. But I like it because it really further describes what you might find in those lower levels of cognitive function. So it talks about strengths, challenges for each level 1 through 4. And then that tips for care column kind of gives you an idea of what someone might need in terms of support. So this is a slide that's often, something like this might be used to train direct care staff, but think about those tips of care and how they might correlate to specific strategies that you might use in therapy or in training a caregiver on how to interact with an individual who has a lower cognitive level. The neurofunctional approach is another way that we think about that cognitive skill development. So in Allen's model, we're looking at scaffolding people from one cognitive level to the next. So our approach is very much based in repetition, providing supports when needed, and really increasing someone's level of self-awareness. And really by about level 4, we notice that someone is actually at a point where they can participate in, say, an hour's worth of therapy or in a group therapy session. So the neurofunctional approach is just a different way to describe how to interact with that person. Allen's levels do give us a description of where they might be, but in terms of how to scaffold them to higher levels of cognitive function, we need some more strategies, some more tools, and that's what the neurofunctional approach does. It provides that idea of how to cue and how to repeat a given task so that someone can start to become more independent with it. This is a great strategy for people who might be emerging out of level 3, solidly at a level 4, or maybe in even the beginning stages of level 5 when you look at Allen's levels. These are patients who may have lost the ability to perform daily activities that would make them more independent. And so in this approach, we could use a task, say, loading the dishwasher, for example. Mass volume repetition in high frequency, so drilling over and over and over on that task until it becomes more automatic is one way we can help someone process through. Another key feature of this specific approach is the level of cueing is very important. So Giles uses an approach called errorless learning, which we're going to go over in greater detail when you get to your behavioral component. But errorless learning is a strategy in which you prompt someone through a task until it becomes more automatic in order for them to reduce frustration. So we don't let them get it wrong. We jump in the minute they start having some trouble. And through both of those components, we can get to more independence with those daily activities. And so this approach has been very effective in getting back to specific tasks, maybe a assembly line type of job or some of those more rote activities in your daily routine. This would be great for that. Now, Toglia is a different approach. Toglia looks at a more dynamic approach to thinking about cognition. So this is a very top-down approach, and it's thinking about someone's overall cognitive ability as it relates to the interaction between the person, the environment, and the occupation. What does that sound like? So it does very much kind of coincide with that PEO framework when you think about the dynamic interaction to create occupational performance. But this is specific to cognitive ability. And so we're thinking about cognition as it relates to all these pieces being different. So your cognitive ability to perform a given task really depends on the environment that you do it in, how familiar that context is, the amount of distraction that you have, or the amount of familiarity you have with a given task. So thinking about things like how to relearn an activity that you automatically did before. You had a stroke and you're learning to put on your shirt but only using one hand. You might always practice that in the context of your bedroom because that's where you optimize your occupational performance, for example. So it's considered restorative in that it does remediate skills, but it also maximizes how you think about the context of that actual occupation to improve someone's overall performance. In this model, we're really thinking about the psychosocial aspects and the metacognitive aspects that go along with the rehabilitation process. So that's another nice feature of the Toglia model, is that she's really thinking about how does someone's self-awareness impact their self-efficacy, which we talked about in the last lecture. So this is a nice compare and contrast for you that looks at the difference between more traditional bottom-up strategies like Giles and Allen's models and that top-down approach that Toglia uses. Now, of course, you can use combinations of these, and one is not necessarily better than the other. It just depends on the client that you have. Sometimes you're working with someone who's a little bit lower functioning cognitively, and they really do need that mass repetition. They're not ready to kind of practice that in a context. Sometimes, though, you're working with somebody who's much more self-aware, and that drilling kind of procedure can seem very elementary, even if it is needed to some extent. So that's kind of how we decide one versus the other. Again, you wouldn't be in a situation where you would be deciding that, but it's good to know how the strategy that you select fits into these perspectives on how to think about cognitive skill remediation. Okay, so some of these slides are going to address example intervention strategies for different areas of cognitive impairment. Again, this is a bottom-up way to think about the problem, but you can also challenge yourself to think about how you might incorporate some of these strategies in a more occupation-focused way. So if you're looking at, for example, issues with divided attention, how could you work on that? Usually you're going to have to compensate. What does it look like at work when you're trying to manage the phone ringing and staying on task with a Word document? Giving someone extra time, putting the phone on mute. These are ways that we would compensate, but they're top down in that we're looking at specific accommodations in the workplace to make that happen. So that's just one example. But look at each of these and see if you can come up with some strategies that would embed that strategy within a greater context for an activity. Here's another one that looks at memory. Okay, so again, these are different kinds of memories. We've talked a lot so far about procedural memory, getting back to some of those more complex tasks and rote learning of those routines. That's a really common area for occupational therapists to help individuals who've had, for example, a brain injury. But you can look at all of these different areas and come up with strategies where those specific interventions might be really useful in a specific scenario. And here's an example of a visual aid. This one is for hand washing. What I wanted to kind of point out about this is that the pictures are really simple, so if you don't have a reader, someone who can look at, these are called Boardmaker. This is a program that you can use to make these pictures, and they're very easy to understand. So you might pair them with words, but you don't have to. Notice that it's placed right at the point at which someone's going to need this information, right? So it's right there at the sink, it's in plain sight, and it's easy to follow from there. Remember that your visuals always need to go left to right, because that's kind of how we're hardwired to interpret information, is that left to right, top to bottom, just like you read. And that you only need to include the essential steps that your specific client is struggling transitioning from. So if they never have trouble remembering to turn on the water, you can omit that step. But if they always have trouble remembering to rub their hands together, you definitely want to represent that step in your visual strip. This is another example. What's nice about this one is that it helps individuals who have poor initiation. So moving from one activity to the next is sort of promoted by this ability to check off from the list. It also keeps somebody who's having trouble with sequencing from losing their place on the page. And so that's a really nice way to do it. This one's for a child, you can see, so the pictures are a little more elementary, but you could easily do the same thing for an adult. This one's a little more adult geared. You can see the pictures are a little bit, less babyish looking, but it gives people sort of like that visual with a time component to remember when they want to do specific things in their routine. Okay, and this one talks about executive function. Now remember, executive function is really important for a variety of things and can be something that we find deficit in a variety of different conditions. And so We are going to be looking specifically at strategies in the next, in part 2 of this video, where we're looking at specific strategies to address executive function. So stay tuned for part 2.